is chapter 23. And so we're going to talk about all the different processes by which we take in food, break it down, and then absorb it into our bodies. One of the interesting things about our digestive system is that it could actually be seen as something that is outside of us. So if you think about it, we have this hollow tube that runs through our body, and we take in stuff from the outside all the time, right? So even just breathing, even just, being in an environment, we're taking in microbes, for example, and they're getting into our digestive tract. And so the digestive tract is really interesting because it also has to protect us against infection. And sometimes that mechanism of being able to absorb nutrients but keep out the bad things goes awry, and then you have like leaky gut, or you have inflammation of the digestive system that could cause bleeding into the digestive system, or it could cause infection. And so we'll talk about those diseases that are associated with the digestive system as well. I already mentioned that there's lymphatic tissue in the small intestine. And do you remember what that lymphatic tissue is called? It's mucus-associated lymphatic tissue, or MALT, and it starts with a P. Peyer's patches, right? So we actually do have the ability to detect microbes in our digestive tract and to have a defense mechanism against them. But there's also good microorganisms in our digestive tract, those probiotics that we take in sometimes when we eat certain foods like yogurt that has living cultures in it. Those also reside in our digestive tract. And so we'll talk about the good gut bacteria and then the bad gut bacteria as well. Okay. So when you look at this digestive system, there's two different mechanisms involved in breaking down our food. So we can talk about mechanical digestion. Right. So mechanical digestion is physically breaking the food down into smaller pieces. And this is actually really important because it allows us to speed up our digestion, right? So it's physically breaking the food into smaller pieces. For example, snakes do not do this. Oftentimes, they will just swallow their prey item whole, and it might take them a couple of months to actually digest the whole thing. And sometimes you can get the snake to regurgitate by just pressing on its digestive tract, and food will come up, and like a whole, frog will come out of its stomach, or a whole rat will come out of its stomach, and it looks like it's all in one piece. And that's because they don't chew their food to break it down mechanically, and it takes a lot longer to digest. And sometimes when we eat, food gets through, right? And it comes out and we can recognize it, and we're like, whoa, why didn't that corn or that peanuts break down? And that's because you did not chew your food properly, right? So mechanical digestion is important. Sometimes chemical digestion cannot occur in some instances unless you break it down, okay? So chemical digestion involves enzymes. And enzymes are proteins that are able to speed up chemical reactions. And they are very precise proteins, and so they tend to only work under certain circumstances. So temperature is important for the regulation of enzyme activity, as is pH. So pH is important in regulating enzyme activity. So when we talk about enzymes, these actually break molecular bonds, but that mechanical digestion allows for there to be a greater surface area over which digestion can take place, over which the enzymes so they bind to the surface. So they bind to the substrate and break chemical bonds. The interesting things about these enzymes is that they do not get used up. So they bind, they help with the chemical reaction, and then they unbind, and then they can go to the next substrate and bind again. So enzymes are really interesting molecules. So you see here, whenever you see in this particular instance, this is secretion. And so we have secretion of enzymes into the small intestine. We have secretion of enzymes by the stomach. Right? We also have secretion that takes place of enzymes that takes place in the mouth. So there's enzymes in the saliva. So those are the two different types of digestion that occurs in our digestive system. Okay, so let's talk about the oral cavity first. So this is obviously your mouth. Okay. And the oral cavity has associated with it the tongue. And the tongue is actually skeletal muscle. So rather than being smooth muscle, like kind of the rest of the muscles in the digestive tract, like your stomach is smooth muscle, the tongue is skeletal muscle. And there's actually two different types of skeletal muscle in it. There's what is referred to as the intrinsic muscle. So this allows your tongue to change shape, but not position. So like it's the intrinsic muscle that allows some of us to roll our tongue, right? To make it fat, to make it flat, right? So that would be its shape, the shape of the tongue. And then we have the extrinsic muscle that allows it to change its position. So like to be able to stick out or pull back in. So when we look at the function of the tongue, one function is to manipulate the food. So the tongue, I think, is actually quite amazing because it doesn't get bit all that often, but its function is to like kind of push food underneath between your molars, for example, and it manipulates it and pushes it, and then it gets out of the way, right? And then you can chew your food. So sometimes, obviously, you bite your tongue, and then you realize and then you keep biting it, right? So you realize how much your tongue does for your manipulation of food once it has become injured, right? So it actually forms the food into a bolus. So we call this a food bolus. And we'll talk about why this is important. This is a ball of food, but we need to swallow food as a bolus. We don't want to just continually swallow small pieces of food because then it will get into our respiratory tract. So we need a big ball of food. And so one of the functions of the tongue is to do that. Okay. It is also important in speech. Okay. And remember that we have cranial nerves that innervate the tongue, like the glossopharyngeal and also the hypoglossal cranial nerve. And so if those become damaged, sometimes it's hard for people to speak because their tongue is not able to change shape to make the sounds to help in speech production. Okay. And then obviously we also have the ability to taste. So we have taste buds on the surface. And what these are is that these allow chemicals that are in solution to come in and bind to receptors. So the taste buds have chemoreceptors that bind chemicals in solution. Now, our ability to taste is really quite primitive. If you think about all the things that we can taste, they believe there's actually only now 5 different tastes. So, for example, we can taste that something is sweet. We can taste that something is sour. We can taste that something is bitter, salty, And the last one is umami. So all of these give us some information about what the nutrient content of our food is. So sweet would mean there's carbohydrates, right? There's sugars. That is used for energy. So something, when you are running low on glucose, you're going to crave something sweet, right? What do you think sour measures? The acidity, the pH. And we'll talk about the saliva, because the saliva has the ability to buffer the stuff in the mouth so that it doesn't change pH so much. But sour is also vitamin C. So vitamin C is a nutrient that we have to have. If we don't have vitamin C, then we start to get sores in our body, and our gums will bleed, and we'll have internal bleeding. I read an interesting article that this is sometimes coming back because people don't realize they need to take in vitamin C. And so this weirdly, if you have just a really bad diet of junk food and there's no vitamin C in it, you can actually get scurvy, modern day scurvy. And they're like, that's so bizarre, right?
Well, actually, one of my parents, like, they're diabetic and their diet is not so great, and they're like trying to tell them, and they're having symptoms of that.
Of scurvy, yeah.
And they don't.
Wow, yeah. So you think that it's not a modern day thing. It used to be a problem when people would travel long distances on ships, for example, right? The scurvy dogs, the pirates, right? They wouldn't have access to fresh fruits and vegetables, and so they would get scurvy. Bitter is actually toxins. And so we tend to, early on, avoid bitter unless we start to get accustomed to the good positive effects. So like coffee. Some people just cannot stand coffee is bitter. And so why would you even want to take it, right? But then it gives you that, kind of the high of the caffeine. And so then you learn to associate bitter with something positive, and then you start to like it. Okay. Salty is sodium chloride. Both of those are really important ions in our body. And does anybody remember what umami? Savory. And so this is protein. Right? And so one of the interesting things is that a lot of junk food will put umami in the form of MSG. MSG is a taste enhancer. So monosodium glutamate is a taste enhancer that makes us think that foods have protein in them. So like you will, or I could eat a whole bag of Doritos because I think my body thinks it's got protein. It's like, oh, it's savory, it's protein, right? But there's no protein in Doritos. And so you kind of crave it because it's umami, right? Chinese food was famous for putting like umami in their soups and sauces, MSG. So some people have a negative reaction to that. Okay, so taste is an important function of the tongue. So in your book, you can see where the tongue is located and how it is located. And you'll also notice that it is connected to the floor of the mouth. This is what is called the frenulum. I think there might be a question on your quiz next week, let's do next week, that talks about that frenulum, which attaches. Sometimes babies are born where the frenulum is too tight and they cannot use their tongue properly, and so they have to like cut that a little bit to allow the tongue to be more mobile. Okay. So the other things that you'll notice here within the oral cavity and associated with the oral cavity are the salivary glands. So the salivary glands are examples of exocrine glands instead of endocrine, right? So they're not endocrine, they're exocrine. And the reason why they're exocrine is they have ducts. And so you have ducts that run under the tongue, right, and have openings. So under the tongue, we have the sublingual salivary gland. We have the submandibular salivary gland, and sometimes that will actually become sore. And so you have lymph nodes under here, under your jaw, but you also have salivary glands underneath the jaw. And then the parotid gland is a big salivary gland that's in your cheek. And the mumps virus, which you might remember from our immunoscenario game, the mumps virus infects that and causes it to swell. And so that's why it makes somebody look like they have stuff in their cheek pouches, right? So they have mumps.
That might eat something sweet, like a little sweet back there.
It might be. So when you take in food, sometimes you can feel that movement of saliva. So all you have to do is think about something sour and your mouth will start to salivate because of that. And sometimes it kind of hurts or tingles or whatever, right? Okay, so when we look at these salivary glands, they're mostly water. And so what that serves to do is moisten our food. Unfortunately, when we are nervous, we get dry mouth, right? That's the sympathetic, the fight or flight response makes us have thick, little saliva. But when we're relaxed, we produce more saliva, right? So it's mostly water. It has IgA in it. So what are those? Immunoglobulins. Those are antibodies. So antibodies are in your saliva. They also have lysozyme. That's something else that breaks down bacteria that is also in your sweat. And then they also have what is referred to as the epidermal growth factor. And this actually helps speed up repair. So, you know, you can bite your tongue, but it tends to, or burn your tongue or whatever, damage your tongue, but it tends to regenerate and repair itself quite quickly. And that might be because the saliva has something in it that speeds up cell division, the epidermal growth factor. Okay, so really spit is actually a good thing for wounds, right? So that when you cut yourself and you put it in your mouth, for example, these would all be protected. They would speed up, as long as you don't have a lot of bacteria in your mouth, bad bacteria, they would speed up production of cells and regeneration, okay? They also contain enzymes, and the enzyme that is found is called salivary amylase. Now, anytime you see that ACE ending, that means it's an enzyme, but not all enzymes have this ACE ending. So for example, we'll talk about pepsin, which is in your stomach, which is an enzyme, but it doesn't end in ACE. But if you see ACE, you know it has to be an enzyme. So this breaks down starch into maltose. So maltose is a disaccharide. It's made of 2 glucose molecules. Starch is a polysaccharide. It's made of many different glucose molecules. So starch in and of itself is really not very palatable. It also is not really water soluble. So if you try to put starch in water, like cornstarch in water, it thickens the water. It sometimes doesn't go into solution very well. So starch, even though it is made up of glucose, is not sweet. Right? So think about eating a raw potato, a bite of a raw potato. Raw potatoes don't have any sweets in them, but when you cook them, they start to get a little bit sweeter because that starch is broken down into simple sugars. So you can take something that is not sweet, put it in your mouth that has starch in it, and then over time, it'll start to taste sweeter. So you could take a piece of bread that's not sweet, and then over time, if you hold it in your mouth, it will turn sweet because of the action of this enzyme. So this is the primary chemical digestion that takes place in the mouth. The mechanical digestion has to do with chewing, right? So this is chemical digestion. Okay, so this is a diagram or an image showing the tongue. It also shows the different lymphatic tissue that is also associated with the tongue. So remember that we had the palatine tonsil. Lingual means tongue. So the lingual tonsil is in the very back. If you get really sick, the very back of your tongue will start to get sore. It could be because it's fighting off infection. And then when we look at the papilla, you don't need to know the different types of papilla here for the midterm exam, but those are the taste buds. Right? So the taste buds are associated with those papilla. And in the past, they thought that you could map your tongue. So like you might taste sweet here, salty in the middle, bitter in the back. But that is actually shown to be incorrect, that there's actually there's no real, they're kind of like distributed all over. So there's no one spot where you taste salty only or where you taste sweet only. They've also discovered that there are people that are called super tasters. And so they can actually look at the density of papilla or taste buds on your tongue. And certain people have a lot more than others. So it is true that some people just do not taste their food as well as others. Women tend to taste better than men. And they think that that might be associated with the fact that when you're pregnant, you have to be very sensitive to the chemicals that you take in. And you tend to not like certain things like bitter because you're protecting the embryo from certain toxins that might be in the food. The males tend to be less likely to be super tasters than females. Okay, so when we look at dentition, these are the teeth. We have different types of teeth that are used for mechanical digestion. So our front teeth are called incisors. And they are specifically designed to clip food. So I'll just put clipping, right? So think about if you're eating a carrot, right? Generally, you don't put it in the back of to bite it off. Generally, you bite it off on the front. Okay? And then we have the canines. Right? So these are sharp and pointy. And so they tend to be for tearing of food. So if you think about eating a piece of beef jerky, if you tried to bite off a piece of beef jerky using your incisors, it wouldn't go very well, right? So you generally put it in the side of your mouth. And then we have the premolars and molars. So the premolars are just smaller, and the molars, and these are used for grinding the food. So mammals, all mammals have what is referred to as heterodont dentition, meaning that we have specialized teeth. When you look at reptiles, like if you looked at like a dinosaur or if you look at a shark, they all have the exact same teeth. And so they believe that the evolution of these different types of teeth just make it so that we can chew our food and extract energy more quickly. And the reason for that we need to do this is because we are endothermic. And we're going to talk about temperature regulation and metabolic rate and stuff. But we regulate our internal temperature using metabolism. So we have to get a lot more energy than a reptile or a cold water fish, for example. And so this is that mechanical digestion. Okay. So if we look at our teeth, we have what are called deciduous teeth. And what do you think deciduous means? Nope, actually, that would be heterodont. Hetero means different teeth. What does a deciduous tree do in the fall? Changes color and the leaves fall, right? So your deciduous teeth are sometimes referred to as your milk teeth. Right? So these are your baby teeth. They come in first, and really weirdly, if you look at a child's skull, and I have one downstairs, you can actually see the adult teeth are in the jaw bones themselves, and they're formed, and they're just pushing, and so those milk teeth form, and then the adult teeth come in, the permanent teeth come in, and push them out. So then we have the permanent teeth. Okay. Sharks are really weird. They have many, many, many different layers of teeth. So as their teeth get worn down, the next layer just kind of pops up. And so they just keep producing teeth throughout their entire life. Rodents have to chew because their teeth will continue to grow and get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so if they don't chew, then it can actually grow into the skull and become a problem. But we have two different types of sets of teeth. Do I have a picture of that? Oh, yeah. So these are the milk teeth, right? And then these are your permanent teeth, incisors, canines, premolars, and molars. Okay. And so it tells when they come in. When we look at the structure of the tooth, you can see that the tooth has some living tissue in it. So this is what is referred to as the pulp. So your pulp cavity. So you need to know the structure of the tooth. You need to know the pulp cavity. Okay. So the pulp cavity contains blood vessels and nerves. And so when the tooth becomes so damaged that you need to have a root canal, they sever the nerve there so that you don't feel anything in that tooth. Right, so they dig that connection out and they separate that connection out between the tooth. Okay, so the next part is what is referred to as the dentin, and this is bone-like material. So that means that it has collagen in it, right? So the dentin is underneath. And it's composed of cells, so it has cells in it. And then the very outer layer of the teeth is what is referred to as enamel. And this, they say, is the strongest substance in the human body, but it is brittle. And it can, you could chip your teeth, you can chip the enamel. And if you are a super toothbrusher like me, they're always worried that you're going to take too much enamel off, right? So they tell you only soft toothbrushes, right? No medium to hard bristles. You don't want to destroy your enamel. So the enamel is acellular, meaning that it is not composed of cells and it is brittle, but it is strong. The other thing that's really important are the gums. So the gingiva, you need to write that one down. That's the gum. And once you start to get older, what they typically do after they clean your teeth and clean off the plaque and the tar from the teeth is they typically measure the gums. And if there is a swollen gum, they get really, really concerned. And what is that called where you start to get swollen gums and they start to bleed? Gingivitis, and it can lead to what is called periodontal disease, right? So periodontal disease is where you have an infection in the gums. And what they're mostly concerned about is your heart and your blood vessels. Because what they found is that there's a link between bad bacteria in your mouth getting into your circulatory system and infecting the lining of your arteries and then causing plaque buildup. And so this leads to problems with the cardiovascular system. So the heart and the blood vessels. So they kind of freak out if you have swollen gums, and they put you on antibiotics, and then they make you come back to make sure that the swelling has gone down because of this particular problem. So it's not that they're worried that your teeth are going to fall out. They're worried that that infection is going to get into your body and go and damage the heart, which would be life-threatening. Okay, so if we look at the structure of the digestive tract, you'll notice that the pharynx is the common opening to the respiratory and to the digestive system, the trachea sits anterior or in front of the esophagus. So like when we do our dissection of the fetal pig, you're going to have to cut the trachea or move it to the side to actually find the esophagus. And you'll notice that unlike the trachea, the esophagus does not have the cartilaginous rings. Okay? So the next structure we're going to talk about is the esophagus. We'll come back to this in a minute. Esophagus, okay. So when we look at the esophagus, it actually transports food that could cause friction and could lead to bleeding. And so your esophagus is composed of simple, stratified epithelial tissue. And this protects against abrasion. So sometimes if you do not swallow your food well and you have like a sharp chip, maybe like a corn chip, right? You swallow it and you can feel it go down. You're like, oh, I can't wait to get it out of my esophagus, because you can almost just feel it scratch, right? All the way down. The other thing is that pills, specifically those gelatin pills, sometimes get stuck there. And what the esophagus does is it senses when there's food in the esophagus and there's an involuntary contraction of the smooth muscle that forces the substances down. And so you can be annoyed by something stuck in your esophagus just simply because you can feel the muscle contractions occurring in the esophagus, trying to push the food down or the pill out of the way, right? And so this has smooth muscle. That is important in involuntary peristalsis. So there's actually two layers of smooth muscle, and this peristalsis means that they contract and they relax, and they contract and they relax, and that just forces the food down through that structure. And this is going down behind the heart, and it is going between the lungs, and eventually it's going to have to pierce the diaphragm. So the esophagus travels through the diaphragm to get to the stomach. This actually creates a valve to prevent the contents of the stomach from coming back up into the esophagus. And so this is the gastroesophageal sphincter. So a sphincter is just a piece of round tissue that works as a valve. So this is the valve between the stomach, the gastro, and the esophagus. So this is a valve that prevents acid reflux. So that would be acid moving up into the esophagus, and the esophagus is not resistant to acid. So the acid is going to start to damage the lining of the esophagus, and that can be a very bad thing. So once you have swallowed, the initial swallowing of the food is voluntary, obviously. We manipulate the food into a bolus, and you'll notice that the bolus moves down. And in order to prevent it from going into the trachea, remember there is my epiglottis. And so the epiglottis folds over and covers the glottis, And remember that it is a mechanical valve, so the food is actually pushing on the glottis to close it. So when you breathe in and inhale your food accidentally, like think about, powdered covered donuts, sugar powder, right? That sometimes that when you breathe it in, it doesn't close that off, and then you get it into your trachea, and then you have to cough it up, right? And food can get stuck if it's swallowed right here, right? And then you can die because you don't get oxygen, and then your brain shuts down and you go into a coma, and you can have permanent brain damage if you are deprived of oxygen because you cannot breathe. So once it gets past, that back of that throat, back of the oropharynx, once it gets into the laryngopharynx, then this is all involuntary, that movement of the food. And so peristalsis proceeds. So we have relaxing and contracting of the smooth muscle. And what they're not showing here is the diaphragm. So your stomach sits below the diaphragm like that. And so there is a spot there, which is the sphincter. So this is my sphincter right here. And so that is hopefully going to stay closed unless food is moving through. And that diaphragm helps to support the sphincter. So that needs to open up when food comes down, but then it should close back up to prevent acid from getting up into the esophagus. So there is a really interesting, or not interesting, but awful kind of thing, because I have it, so I know how awful it is. This is what is referred to as a hiatal hernia. And the way they diagnose this is by using an endoscope. So they stick a scope down your esophagus, and they go down, and what they discover is that part of your stomach is sticking up above the diaphragm. Okay, so part of the stomach is above the diaphragm. And this could be due to pregnancy. So when the baby's in your abdominal cavity or in your uterus, it puts pressure, right? It can also just be the straining. So abdominal straining can sometimes push that stomach up. And I think in my case, it's probably hereditary because everybody in my family has this problem. So you get what is referred to as GERD. So gastroesophageal reflux disease. So this is essentially heartburn. So one way that they treat this is by giving people acid reducers. So some of these are now over the counter. It used to be that you actually had to have a prescription for them. And so Zantac is one. Omeprazole is another big one, which is Prilosec. Sorry, that's Prilosec. Okay. And what these actually do is they're called proton pump inhibitors. So a proton is a hydrogen ion. So proton and hydrogen ion is the same thing. Hydrogen ion is what is released because your stomach has hydrochloric acid in it. So your cells actually have pumps that take and produce hydrogen ions and secrete them to the outside. So they pump them out. And so if you take these, it essentially means that your stomach is not acidic. So even if you take in a meal, you don't have a lot of acidity. Even if you take in bad bacteria, you don't have the acidity to break it down. So the downside to this, to these proton pump inhibitors, is that you're not able to digest things as well, specifically like protein. And also, you're probably going to get sick more often from foodborne illnesses that are caused by like bad bacteria, like E. coli, right? But the upside is that you're not going to have damage to your esophagus. So what would happen in the past before these is that the esophagus would get so damaged that you would get esophageal cancer. So the hydrochloric acid, that's the hydrochloric acid in the esophagus. Can damage the cells and lead to esophageal cancer.
Actually went in for something like this. I had too much stomach acid, and they found a 2-inch node in my esophagus that they removed.
Too much hydrochloric acid, yes. So do you have to be on those proton pump inhibitors too?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have to take them.
And it's really kind of scary because they don't know the long-term effects of some of those proton pump inhibitors. And so some people are saying, don't stay on omeprazole. But it's like, if I try to go off omeprazole, I'm excruciating pain. The problem is that omeprazole creates polyps in your stomach. So when I went back again, he's like, well, you have polyps in your stomach. And I'm like, what? He's like, oh, it's just a byproduct of the omeprazole. And so they really don't know what the long-term effect is. The other interesting thing is that like when you travel to countries where the water supply might have bad bacteria in it, you're probably going to be much more prone to getting foodborne illnesses than other people that have a real acid stomach, right? And it's harder to digest, like steak. I feel like when I eat meat, it stays in my stomach for forever because it doesn't get broken down in a high like it would if it was in a high acid environment.
Yeah, I've noticed I'll eat and it takes a lot longer for me to get hungry again.
Right.
Less now.
Yeah. So one thing that they can do is that, or they used to do, is they used to go in, actually they still do it, but they pull that piece of the stomach down and then they use some of the muscles around it to secure it and try to keep it down below the diaphragm. The problem with that is that it tends to last only about 10 years. And so you have to keep going back for the procedure over and over and over again because it doesn't seem to be a permanent fix for it. Okay, so let's stop there for today, and then we'll talk about next about the different layers of the digestive system wall and what protects the stomach from the acid.